Right now, tensions simmer quietly, while many wonder if a much bigger move is simply being delayed. Fact 1. If China were waiting for the perfect moment to act, the most immediate impact would likely be on Taiwan. A sudden military move could disrupt global semiconductor supply chains overnight. Taiwan produces the majority of advanced chips used in American technology, from smartphones to military systems. The US economy, already dependent on these components, could face immediate shortages, rising prices, and production delays. This wouldn't just be a regional conflict. It would directly affect American households, businesses, and national security infrastructure within weeks. Fact 2. Financial markets would react instantly and aggressively. If China made a decisive move, global stock markets could drop sharply within hours. American retirement accounts, pensions, and investments tied to international trade would take a hit. The US and its allies would likely impose sanctions, but China's deep integration into global supply chains means those sanctions would also hurt American companies. Major corporations with manufacturing ties to China could see massive losses, forcing layoffs and economic slowdown at home. Fact 3. The United States would face a critical decision: intervene or not. If China acted strategically, choosing a moment when global attention is divided or US leadership is politically constrained, the response might be delayed or limited. This could shift global power dynamics significantly. Allies in Asia, such as Japan and South Korea, would question US reliability. At the same time, direct military involvement could escalate into a large-scale conflict between nuclear powers, something policymakers would try to avoid at all costs. Fact 4. Energy and trade routes would become immediate pressure points. A conflict involving China could disrupt major shipping lanes in the South China Sea, through which a significant portion of global trade passes. Oil prices could spike, affecting gas prices across the United States. Everyday goods, from electronics to clothing, could become more expensive or harder to find. Even without direct combat on US soil, American consumers would feel the consequences quickly, as global stability directly influences domestic cost of living. Fact 5. If China waited for a moment when the US is politically divided, the response could be slower and less unified. Internal disagreements in Washington could delay decisions on sanctions, military support, or diplomatic action. This hesitation would send a powerful signal globally that America is struggling to act quickly under pressure. At the same time, some Americans might support avoiding conflict altogether, arguing against another overseas crisis. The country could become deeply split between those demanding strength and those fearing escalation, creating tension not just abroad, but inside the United States itself. Fact 6. A carefully timed move could expose how dependent the US still is on Chinese manufacturing. Even with efforts to bring production back home, many critical goods, from pharmaceuticals to electronics, still rely on Chinese factories. If those supply chains were suddenly cut or restricted, shortages could appear within weeks. However, this could also trigger a long-term shift, American companies accelerating domestic production and reducing reliance on foreign manufacturing. In the short term, Americans might face higher prices and fewer options, but in the long term, it could strengthen economic independence. Fact 7. Cyber warfare would likely play a major role, and Americans might feel it directly. Instead of traditional attacks, disruptions could target power grids, financial systems, or communication networks. Even limited cyber operations could cause temporary outages, banking issues, or data breaches. This would create a sense of vulnerability inside the US, far from any battlefield. At the same time, it could push the US to strengthen its cyber defenses rapidly, investing more into infrastructure protection and digital security than ever before. Fact 8. If China acted at a moment when global alliances are shifting, some countries might choose neutrality instead of supporting the US. This would be a major change from past conflicts. Nations dependent on Chinese trade might hesitate to take sides, weakening coordinated international pressure. For Americans, this could feel like a loss of global influence. However, it could also push the US to rebuild and strengthen alliances more intentionally, focusing on long-term partnerships rather than assumptions of automatic support. Fact 9. If China acted after years of quietly strengthening its military, the initial phase could be fast and difficult to counter. The United States might find that China's regional capabilities, especially in the Pacific, have grown beyond what many Americans expect. This wouldn't mean the US is weaker overall, but it could face serious challenges operating far from home. For Americans, this realization could be unsettling. At the same time, it could trigger a major national effort to modernize defense systems and increase preparedness in ways not seen in decades. Fact 10. A sudden escalation could push the US into a new kind of Cold War, one defined by technology, trade, and influence rather than constant direct conflict. American companies might be forced to fully separate from Chinese markets, leading to a divided global economy. This would mean higher costs, fewer global options, and a more fragmented world. However, it could also encourage innovation within the US, as domestic industries compete to replace lost partnerships and develop independent supply chains. Fact 11. If China chose a moment when global crises are already unfolding, such as conflicts in other regions or economic instability, the world's ability to respond would be stretched thin. The US could be forced to divide attention and resources across multiple challenges. For Americans, this could mean increased military spending and a stronger focus on national security. But it could also accelerate strategic planning, forcing leaders to rethink priorities and invest in long-term resilience rather than reacting to one crisis at a time. Fact 12. Information warfare would likely intensify, targeting not just governments but the American public directly. Social media platforms could become battlegrounds of influence, with narratives designed to divide opinion and create confusion. Americans might struggle to distinguish between real information and manipulation. This could deepen mistrust within society. On the other hand, it could also lead to greater awareness of misinformation, encouraging stronger media literacy and more critical thinking among the public over time. Fact 13. If China waited for a moment when the US economy shows signs of weakness, the impact could be amplified significantly. A major external shock during an economic slowdown could push the US closer to recession. Job markets might tighten, and consumer confidence could drop. However, crises have historically driven major economic shifts in America. This could accelerate investment in infrastructure, manufacturing, and technology, potentially leading to a stronger and more self-reliant economy in the long run after a difficult adjustment period. Fact 14. If China acted during a moment when US military resources are stretched globally, response times in the Pacific could be slower than expected. The US maintains commitments in Europe, the Middle East, and other regions. A sudden crisis in Asia would force rapid redeployment decisions. For Americans, this could raise serious concerns about readiness and global priorities. However, it could also lead to a long-term restructuring of US military strategy, focusing more heavily on the Indo-Pacific and ensuring faster, more concentrated response capabilities in future conflicts. Fact 15. A conflict triggered at the perfect moment could reshape global trade alliances almost overnight. Countries that depend on Chinese manufacturing might begin searching for alternatives, potentially shifting production toward nations like India, Vietnam, or even back to the United States. This transition would not be immediate. Americans could face higher costs and supply instability in the short term, but over time, it could reduce dependence on a single global manufacturing hub, making supply chains more resilient and diversified. Fact 16. If China moved strategically, it could test the limits of US deterrence without triggering full-scale war. This might include blockades, limited actions, or grey zone tactics that fall below traditional definitions of conflict. For Americans, this creates uncertainty. How should the US respond when the line between peace and war is blurred? At the same time, it could push US leadership to develop clearer strategies for these scenarios, strengthening deterrence policies and avoiding miscalculations that could lead to larger escalation. Fact 17. The global technology race would accelerate dramatically. If China acted at a decisive moment, it could attempt to secure dominance in areas like artificial intelligence, telecommunications, and advanced manufacturing. The US might respond with massive investment in innovation and research, similar to past national efforts during major global competition. For Americans, this could mean more funding for science, education, and infrastructure, but also increased competition and pressure in key industries that shape the future economy. Fact 18. A carefully timed move could impact how Americans view global leadership and national identity. If the US response is seen as strong and coordinated, it could reinforce confidence at home and abroad. But if it appears uncertain or divided, it could trigger a deeper national conversation about America's role in the world. This moment could redefine how Americans see their country, not just as a superpower, but as a nation facing real limits and new challenges in a rapidly changing global order. Fact 19. If China acted at a moment when US allies in Asia feel directly threatened, countries like Japan could rapidly expand their military role. This would mark a major shift in global security dynamics. For Americans, this could mean sharing the burden of defense rather than carrying it alone. However, it could also increase the risk of a broader regional conflict involving multiple nations. At the same time, stronger allied cooperation could create a more balanced power structure, potentially preventing long-term dominance by any single country. Fact 20. A sudden crisis could force the US government to prioritize defense spending over domestic programs. This might lead to difficult trade-offs, less funding for infrastructure, healthcare, or education in the short term. Americans could feel this directly through policy changes and economic pressure. However, increased defense investment has historically driven technological breakthroughs. Industries connected to aerospace, cybersecurity, and manufacturing could grow rapidly, creating new jobs and opportunities, even as other areas face constraints. Fact 21. If China chose a moment when global public opinion is divided, it could shape the narrative in its favor. Some countries might frame the situation as a regional issue rather than a global crisis. For Americans, this could feel like a loss of moral leadership on the world stage. However, it could also push the US to communicate its position more clearly and rebuild international trust through diplomacy, not just military strength. Public opinion could become as important as military action itself. Fact 22. A well-timed move could test the resilience of the US economy under pressure. Inflation could rise as supply chains are disrupted, and consumer confidence might drop. Americans could feel uncertainty in everyday life, higher prices, market volatility, and job concerns, but historically economic shocks have also driven adaptation. Businesses may become more flexible, supply chains more localized, and innovation more urgent. Over time, this could create a more durable economic system, even if the transition is difficult. Fact 23. If China acted during a period of rapid technological change, control over emerging technologies could become a central issue. The competition would extend beyond territory to influence over data, infrastructure, and innovation. For Americans, this could mean stricter regulations on technology, increased government involvement, and a stronger push for domestic development. While this might limit some global collaboration, it could also ensure that critical technologies remain secure and aligned with national interests. Fact 24. A decisive moment could reshape how future generations of Americans understand global risk. For decades, many have grown up without direct experience of major power conflict. A sudden shift would change that perception quickly. It could lead to increased civic engagement, greater interest in national security, and a deeper awareness of global interdependence. At the same time, it could also bring anxiety and uncertainty, reminding Americans that stability is not guaranteed, and that global events can have immediate personal consequences. Fact 25. If China acted at a moment when US defense supply chains are strained, replenishing military equipment could take longer than expected. Modern warfare depends heavily on advanced components, many of which rely on global manufacturing. For Americans, this could raise concerns about readiness and sustainability in a prolonged crisis. However, it could also trigger a major push to rebuild domestic defense production, strengthening national security over time and reducing reliance on foreign suppliers for critical military technologies. Fact 26. A carefully timed move could impact global currency dynamics. The US dollar has long been the world's dominant reserve currency, but a major geopolitical shift could accelerate efforts by other countries to reduce dependence on it. For Americans, this might mean increased volatility in financial markets and potential long-term changes in economic influence. At the same time, it could push the US to reinforce its financial leadership through stronger economic policies, innovation, and global partnerships that maintain confidence in the dollar. Fact 27. If China acted while the US is facing internal social tensions, the effects could extend beyond foreign policy. External pressure often amplifies domestic divisions, as Americans debate priorities, risks, and responses. This could lead to stronger political polarization in the short term. However, history also shows that external challenges can unify the country over time. A shared sense of urgency could bring renewed focus on national cohesion, encouraging cooperation across political and social lines when it becomes most necessary. Fact 28. A strategic move could disrupt global food and resource supply chains. China plays a significant role in global trade of fertilizers, rare materials, and agricultural products. Disruptions could indirectly affect food prices and availability in the United States. Americans might notice gradual increases in grocery costs or changes in supply. On the other hand, this could encourage greater domestic production and investment in agriculture, strengthening food security and reducing vulnerability to global disruptions in the long term. Fact 29. If China chose a moment when emerging markets are already unstable, the global economic shock could spread quickly. Financial stress in developing economies could lead to broader instability, affecting international trade partners of the United States. For Americans, this might translate into reduced export opportunities and slower economic growth. However, it could also position the US as a stabilizing force, strengthening its leadership role by supporting global recovery efforts and reinforcing economic partnerships. Fact 30. A decisive and well-timed action could redefine how deterrence works in the modern world. If traditional warnings and red lines fail to prevent escalation, the US and its allies may need to rethink how they signal strength and prevent conflict. For Americans, this could mean a shift in defense strategy, foreign policy, and long-term planning. While this uncertainty could be unsettling, it could also lead to more effective and realistic approaches to maintaining peace in an increasingly complex global landscape. Fact 31. If China acted at a moment when US intelligence underestimates the timing, the initial shock could be psychological as much as strategic. Americans have long relied on early warning and preparedness. A surprise development would challenge that confidence. It could lead to immediate calls for accountability and reform within intelligence agencies. At the same time, it could strengthen future capabilities, forcing improvements in surveillance, analysis, and coordination. In the long run, this kind of wake-up moment has historically made US systems more precise and responsive. Fact 32. A well-timed move could influence global perception of power more than the action itself. If China appears decisive and coordinated, while the US response seems delayed or cautious, it could shift how other nations view leadership. For Americans, this would not just be about policy. It would feel personal, challenging long-held assumptions about global influence. However, perception can change quickly. A strong measured response could restore confidence and demonstrate that stability, not speed, defines true leadership. Fact 33. If China acted during a period of technological vulnerability, such as reliance on satellites or digital infrastructure, the consequences could extend beyond military systems. Disruptions to GPS, communications, or financial networks could affect everyday American life. Navigation, banking, and even emergency services could face temporary instability. This would highlight how interconnected modern life has become. At the same time, it could accelerate investment in backup systems and resilience, ensuring that critical infrastructure can withstand future disruptions. Fact 34. A carefully chosen moment could test the limits of escalation control. Both the US and China understand the risks of full-scale conflict, especially between nuclear powers. If tensions rise quickly, the challenge becomes managing escalation without losing credibility. For Americans, this could create a sense of uncertainty. How far will this go? However, it could also reinforce the importance of diplomacy, communication channels, and crisis management strategies designed to prevent worst-case scenarios while still protecting national interests. Fact 35. If China truly waits for the perfect moment, the biggest impact may not be the action itself, but what it reveals. It would show how prepared, or unprepared, the United States is across military, economic, and social systems. For Americans, this could be a defining moment of reflection. It could expose vulnerabilities, but also strengths that are often underestimated. History shows that the US tends to adapt under pressure. The question is not just what happens, but how the country responds when it matters most. The moment may never come, or it may define everything. What do you think happens next?